good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Well, if you're interested in learning more about supply chain and the supply chain program here at the Wisconsin School of Business, you've come to the right place. My name is Randy Parvin. I'm Assistant Director of Admissions for Recruitment in the MBA and MS programs here. Today, we're going to get a better understanding of supply chain management and the many ways it affects us today. But before we get started, just some housekeeping issues. Please mute your microphone if you're listening, and if you have questions, we'll address those later, or if they're germane as we go along. Well, we've got a great group of panelists to have a discussion today about supply chain, and I wrote out some bios, and then I thought, no, let's have them. They can probably state best about their backgrounds, and introduce themselves. So, who would like to go first?
I can go first, Randy.
Thanks, Jake.
So my name is Jake Dean. I'm the director of the Granger Center for Supply Chain Management here within the Wisconsin School of Business, which itself is within the University of Wisconsin-Madison campus. So within that means I have responsibility from a day-to-day perspective for all of the supply chain programs we offer, both undergraduate and graduate. I work closely with our students from an advising perspective, and I teach courses in supply chain fundamentals, supply chain consulting, and applied learning. My background in supply chain is almost 20 years. I've got one more until it's officially 20. But most of that was spent in industry. So working in supply chain planning and supply chain acquisition integration in the retail and technology industries. And I am also a graduate from a number of years ago from the Wisconsin School of Business's supply chain MBA. So great to be here and share some of that experience.
Awesome. Thank you, Jake. Greg, would you like to go next?
Sure. My name's Greg DeCroy, and I'm a professor in the Wisconsin School of Business, and I serve as the academic director of the Granger Center for Supply Chain Management. So I work closely with Jake on looking at the strategy and future plans for the center and for our programs, and deal with more kind of faculty related issues around curriculum or getting programs approved and things of that nature, while Jake does more of the day-to-day and working with student advising and things like that. I've been at the University of Wisconsin since 2006. I got my PhD at Stanford University, and I've worked at University of Washington and Duke University before coming to Wisconsin. But I'm excited to be here and be part of this program and work with Jake and others in this center.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. And with us via phone is Claudia. And Claudia, unfortunately, you have to pronounce your last name for me. And go ahead and tell us about yourself.
Sure, thanks, Randy. Claudia Knowlton-Chaik, and I'm currently the Senior Director of Global Logistics Operations at Google. And so my job is to really provide leadership to all the global transportation, the warehousing, the import-export trade compliance, the remarketing, packaging, and all the automation projects that enable Google's data centers. And we go a little bit beyond the data centers, and we support Waymo and Verily and some of the alphabets, if you will. So some of my previous experiences are with IBM, GE, Motorola, Facebook, and a couple of chemical companies. So I've got 37 years of industry experience, starting as an engineer and then flipping over and loving the supply chain. I am a graduate of the University of Wisconsin school system, and so I can only say good things about University of Wisconsin. I do serve currently on the Granger Advisory Board for Supply Chain Management at University of Wisconsin. And here at Google, I also serve as the Executive DE&I Champion for the Supply Chain Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And during COVID, I developed the Food Supply Chain Coalition, which consists of 27 MBA students, that includes UW-Madison. And lastly, family is everything, and I enjoy spending time with my husband, 4 children, and 9 grandbabies, soon to be 12.
Oh, wow. Wow. Mm-hmm. Well, welcome. Okay. Now, I have some questions, and I'll address each of you, but if someone wants to jump in with, some additional thoughts, if there's some gaps that you want to cover, please, feel free. Well, Greg, supply chain is a relatively, business discipline compared to more established areas like finance or, let's say, marketing. So many people aren't familiar with it. Could you give us a brief definition so we're all kind of on the same page?
Sure. You're right, Randy. A lot of people don't really know what supply chain or supply chain management is, despite the fact that it's absolutely central to how we live our lives and how the global economy runs.
Hmm.
Um, Put simply, I guess I'd say supply chain management is about managing the flow of goods from ultimate supplier all the way through ultimate customer. So that could involve all the way to, extracting raw materials or harvesting plant materials at the upstream end, turning those, processing those, turning them into items that could be used, maybe components that then get assembled into finished products, going through distribution channels downstream until it gets to either to a retailer or some other source that an ultimate customer would buy through. And that process may involve manufacturing, may involve lots of transportation, storage, and it involves, reading the customer and understanding what their needs are. And everything around us has a supply chain. So people watching this, I'm going to assume perhaps that someone watching this is watching it on an electronic device, maybe sitting in a chair in a building. And so that electronic device has a supply chain, the chips, the processors, the display, all the electronics in it, the power cord, whatever it may be. And the chair has a supply chain of the materials it's made of and the manufacturer and how it got to you through a distribution channel. The building had materials that were used to produce it. There's supply chains involved in all of that. If you ate a meal today, there are supply chains for all the different foods that you might have eaten today. So it's absolutely central to the way we live our lives. It's central to the global economy. I'll just extend slightly. It doesn't just involve the movement of goods. To support all of that, it also involves the processing, management, and sharing of data and information. And so you have to gather data to understand what's going on with your customers, what's happening to demand. Gather data on your suppliers so you understand, are they producing quality? Are they financially stable? Where in the supply chain are my goods? Keeping track of that information is critical. And also managing financial flows. It costs money to purchase things, to manufacture things, to store things, move them around. And then, of course, there are revenues coming in from selling things and making all of those cash flows balance out in a way that is sustainable. All falls within the realm of supply chain management. So you can see it spans throughout an entire business, an entire enterprise is touched in one way or another by its supply chain operations.
Yeah, true. Well, let me just follow up on that. I think COVID-19 kind of showed us all the importance of supply chain. I mean, I like many people was searching for tissue paper and wipes and masks, and even at one point I couldn't find puzzles to put together as our family was home. Um, you know, why was it so difficult to keep stuff on the shelves when it was always there for me, prior to COVID? Is that a supply chain issue, or you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that COVID brought to mind, and in addition to maybe having more people familiar with the term supply chain, um, we kind of take supply chains for granted in what I'll call normal or stable times. And
Mhm.
those that, when things change, it causes disruptions. Um, the main job of a supply chain is to match supply with demand. So if I can get the right product to the right place at the right time in the right quantities to meet demand, that's exactly what we want to do. And for a lot of the products that you mentioned and a lot of products that we deal with, in the long run, demand is relatively stable. I'll say maybe more correctly, in the short to medium term, demand is relatively stable. It doesn't fluctuate a whole lot. Think about toilet paper or paper towels. Demand is relatively flat. It may grow with population growth or maybe a little bit faster in developing economies where people have more purchasing power.
Uh-huh.
And when that's the case, then supply chains can be designed to be fairly efficient, meaning we don't have a lot of excess production capacity sitting idle. We have just enough, maybe a tiny bit more to handle a little bit of ups and downs. We don't have a lot of excess inventory sitting in warehouses, just enough to meet near-term demand, maybe a little bit of a cushion, and so on. And that works great. And in fact, it keeps costs down. And as long as that demand stays relatively predictable, it allows us to have very smooth running supply chains. What happened with COVID is there were disruptions that occurred, and they occurred both on the supply side and the demand side. On the supply side, we may have had, businesses that had to slow down because some workers got sick, or they had to distance more in facilities to keep their workers safe. And that reduced the amount of capacity they had to either produce things or move things or whatever it may be. On the demand side was where we saw some of the huge hits for some of these items. So let me talk less abstractly, talk about some specific examples.
Yeah.
The classic one that we were talking about in this country a lot was toilet paper. Well, overall demand for toilet paper didn't really change that much. But what happened is we moved from working in office buildings and other sort of businesses and being in schools and universities. People were at home to a large extent. And the grade and packaging and distribution channels of toilet paper for commercial settings is very different from it is for home settings. And the equipment can't simply be switched over to make this other type. And so overall demand didn't change. It just shifted from A to B, and there wasn't the capacity to keep up with B. So that's a demand spike with some supply pullback because of, again, distancing and so on. The problem is that without that excess capacity, a lot of times it takes a long time for supply chains to ramp back up, to build and install equipment to do these things. And you don't want to do that just in time for the COVID problem to go away, and now you're stuck with this excess capacity. On the customer side, what they then might do is very rational. If you know you can always get paper towels and wipes and everything at the store when you want them, you don't keep that much excess in your home. Suddenly, if you don't know if it's going to be days, weeks, or months before you can get toilet paper and paper towels, you're buying it every chance you get, and you're hoarding it in your pantry or in your closets. And that has an extra kick to demand, which makes the problem even worse in terms of managing, balancing supply and demand. Really quickly on the puzzle issue, and I'll throw in another one, which is bicycles was something that after the fact we could explain, but in advance, it's like nobody really expected that. And that really gets at, there are so many interconnections in supply chains and in our economy. What happened with COVID? Health clubs and gyms were closed because of the health risk. People still wanted to stay in shape. How are they going to do that at home? Well, they also wanted to get together with friends, but they had to distance and preferably do it outside. You put all those things together, outside with friends exercising, a bicycle is a perfect solution because you have to stay a certain distance and so on.
Yeah.
So suddenly people were snatching up bikes, especially since some of the shutdowns were happening in the US, right as the weather was starting to improve. And so things that you didn't anticipate impacting your business did impact your business and cause this huge demand spike. So all the interconnectedness really drove some of these challenges that we found in terms of finding things on the shelves.
Fascinating. Jake or Claudia, anything you'd like to add to what Greg shared with us?
Well, I think you did a great job of explaining it, and it transfers into food. We saw it in the food supply chains where, restaurants weren't buying, cruise ships weren't, shipping, and now the food banks needed individualized packaging versus these, big, huge 70 blocks of cheese. They now needed individual size servings. So, it really is how fast you can respond to the consumer, because the consumer drives the supply chain, and it definitely changed when a huge pandemic came. Yeah.
Okay, Jake, it looked like we're going to share something.
No, I was just going to say Greg did a good job in explaining it. I think we can go on to the next question.
All right. Well, this leads us to Claudia and Jake, what do you think supply chain practitioners have learned over the last year that will improve their businesses and business over the future?
Claudia, you're leading a supply chain. I would be interested to hear how you'd answer that question.
Thanks. Yeah, and so even beyond COVID, we've always got disruptions that are happening in the supply chain. So we had COVID-19, we had capacity constraints, we had civil unrest. Fortunately, oil prices have stayed stable, but there are many lessons learned. And I think for those supply chains that proactively build in resiliency to their into their offerings are those that are going to continue to win. And some of the things are, preparing through a business continuity plan and actually testing those. A lot of companies talk about BCPs but they never really test them. And there's ways to actually do real simulations of those BCPs or do tabletop exercises. But I would say that is a key activity to build resilience into your organization, your processes, and your technology, and always be looking around the corners at what will come next. I think the other thing that really helped us is that we had strategic partnerships. So we move goods globally. We have warehouses globally. We don't, change every, quarter on, saving a penny. We instead build long-term relationships, and those relationships really carry you through these kind of disruptions where that if you need to block space on airplanes because you've just lost a lot of capacity, that your partner's going to be working with you and will get that capacity for you. So I think those partnerships, you can't underestimate the value of those partnerships in a disruption like this. And beyond that, it's looking at, how do you look at the broader economic model and your business continuity planning and balance the safety of your people, the compliance, the trade compliance piece, as well as, where you're sourcing your goods and making sure that you've got a regional capability for getting the source of your goods and that you're not all counting in one, from one supplier in one geographic location, that you're able to have a more holistic view. And along with that comes technology, visibility, supply chain security are all, really important to us as we think about that. There's a whole list of things like conducting route risk analysis, conducting vulnerability assessments, developing a global team that can follow the sun 24/7. That's really important in my world. Again, the GPS on shipments, the technology, conducting in-depth analysis on, identifying high-risk lanes, implementing countermeasures, conducting security training, nearshoring, looking at nearshoring, but really continuing to look at your supplier base and doing a due diligence on your marketplace and your suppliers, having a supplier risk assessment program. And those are just, there's a whole list. There's not one size fits all when it comes to preparing for a disruption like this, especially one that's lasted this long.
Yeah.
But I can tell you at Google, we've been very successful. We've kept our data centers up and running. You haven't read about any disastrous situation where we took our customers down, or people couldn't go to YouTube or do their search. And so it is something that we take very seriously every single day, not just when the disruption happens.
It's interesting you point out that there was no disruptions in Google, and I hadn't thought about that. There wasn't, right? You don't think about these things until there's a disruption,
Yep.
which I suppose is good. Which brings me, and anyone could take this question, which brings me to the latest thing. I recently went to my local Home Depot and Menards, and I noticed building supplies are like 2x4s and plywood is just spiking. Is that a supply chain issue, or anyone want to take that question?
Almost everything is a supply chain issue, but I'm somewhat biased in the way I view the world. So yeah, I mean, again, think about kind of the supply and demand swing. imagine again, what did we do as individuals? Many of us, and some people were still working outside the home, and thankfully many were, that kept things running that we all needed. But a lot of us were spending more time in our home. And what happens when you spend more time in your home? You start looking around and you start thinking, we need a little more space, or I'd like to have a deck so I could go outside. And so there is some amount of increased demand for building supplies from, do-it-yourselfers. But also, housing starts have been going up as well. On the demand side, or on the supply side rather, again, Jake, mentioned earlier something about, I think it was before we started actually having the live chat, about shipping containers and rail and trucking capacity. One of the things that happened when we didn't go to bars and restaurants and take vacations and cruises and travel
Yeah.
on planes is we had more money left over. We spent it on things. What did we spend it on? Well, some of it is home electronics, so we could do things like this. And some of it was just other goods that we decided to purchase. Some of that was on improving our homes. But even if it wasn't, if we were buying things, many of the things that we buy in the US are imported. They come from Asia. That means cargo ships and containers and rail and truck and port capacity to be able to import these things was more pressure was put on those things. And then anything that you wanted to bring in was subject to facing those additional constraints. Those,
Okay.
30 or 40 ships backed up off the West Coast that can't get into the US onto the ground because of that. So again, increased demand for certain things and also certain types of supply elements being constrained kind of went in opposite directions, and supply equals demand was an equation that we were having trouble getting to match up.
Sure.
There's another interesting dimension to Randy, you mentioned specifically building supplies. Many of those are made from wood, right? And
Right.
wood comes from trees. And trees aren't made in factories, right? Trees grow in forests. And so if you all of a sudden need more wood, which means you need more trees, you can't just automatically turn up your tree production, right? That when you're dealing with a natural resource supply chain like that, when something is growing out of the ground, you can say the same thing for livestock and a bunch of other raw materials. Back to what Greg said earlier about how you plan capacity and how you plan for demand. You can't just all of a sudden produce more wood necessarily because you don't have trees that are in the right state of their age to be able to supply the lumber that you need. So it's an interesting, that one is a specifically interesting supply chain issue.
Yeah, you can ramp up production, I suppose. It's going to take you 20, 30 years,
Potentially. Yeah.
I mean, literally. Well, Jake, let's just follow up. I had what areas of the at UW-Madison, what areas of the supply chain curriculum do you think will prepare students to solve some of these challenges we've already mentioned?
Well, I think there's a few. We have a course in all of our programs on supply chain IT. And so the ability for partners in a supply chain and systems in a supply chain to communicate with each other and share information like end demand and supply situations and things like that. Those are going to be really key going forward. I spent some time talking to, or since this has started, I've talked to many people on our board and elsewhere about how their supply chains are responding. And the overwhelming answer that I get is we have put previously to this planning processes and systems in place that have allowed us to make decisions with much less information or much more quickly than we would have in the past without these processes and systems. And they're really reaping the benefits of those things now. In the absence of those, it would have taken them much longer to respond to these crazy increases or decreases in demand. So I think the more attention we can pay to processes and systems that integrate supply chains, because that's one of the challenges of supply chain management, is that there are many partners in a supply chain and they're not all organizationally connected, right? Your supplier is a different company, your distributor is a different company, potentially your manufacturer is a different company. So the more we can use systems to share information on what's going on, both with demand and supply, I think that will serve, people in supply chain and our students well as they move into their careers. I don't know, Greg, from a curricular perspective, you had anything to add there?
Sure. Yeah, I'd like to add on a little bit. So, we view supply chain kind of as my original description suggested, we view it in a very kind of end-to-end way. And so we try to address that in our curriculum. We have courses on strategic sourcing and where you're going to, what suppliers are you going to choose, where should they be, what criteria should you use to select them, how many of them should you have, and so on. Trading off cost versus being nearby versus capacity versus quality, all those things. We have a course in logistics about moving the stuff around and how you manage to move it through your supply chain. We have downstream facing curriculum course on marketing channels that looks at how do you want to reach your customer? Are you going to work through distributors? Are you, if it's consumers, are you going to have retail stores? Are you going to sell online? How are you going to reach your customers? And then other courses that tie things together, such as Jake mentioned, this information technology. I teach a course on supply chain analytics that goes a deeper dive into data and analytical methods for making predictions and solving problems. I have a course on supply chain finance about the financial dimensions of dealing with all of this. And then I'll expand a bit beyond our kind of specific supply chain curriculum. We are fortunate in the Wisconsin School of Business to be part of a very robust school of business, but also embedded within a world-class university. Within the School of Business, we partner very closely with related areas that either have their own MS programs or have MBA specializations or undergraduate programs in specific areas. For example, we partner closely with the risk management group on, for obvious reasons, a lot of things we've talked about in here, in particular Claudia's comments touched on issues of risk. So we had some very interesting interactions where kind of our supply chain expertise from the faculty and staff and our students combined with the even deeper risk management expertise from that faculty, staff, and student body really come together in a way that's very rich. Kind of on a downstream end, we have a Center for Marketing Analytics, and so some of their expertise really focusing very much on the consumer, which is a piece of what we do, but leveraging that and having interactions with them is really great. But then even broadly within the university, entities like the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies, we do collaborations and programs with them as well. Sustainability issues becoming bigger and bigger issues for companies to deal with. The supply chain is a natural place to be concerned about that. Not only a company's own operations and the environmental impacts and the social impacts in terms of how employees are treated and so on, but also your suppliers and your suppliers' suppliers and so on. The ability to leverage the supply chain structure to have positive impacts on the world, both environmental and in terms of worker safety and equity and ethics and things of that nature, is tremendous. So it's a place where a lot of those efforts are often focused within a company. And plus all the other departments within the university, we really have, I think, a lot of opportunities for students to get the education, the core education, plus also tailoring it a bit to their particular interests or angles that they want to look at within supply chain.
Okay. All right. Well, we've got a few minutes left, and so I have a final question for each of you. If you can maybe add something to this. What excites you about the future of supply chain, or where do you see the career going? Either one of those that you might like to address. Claudia, would you like to go first?
Sure. So what excites me about the future of supply chain is really developing the pipeline of talent and growing the leaders for the supply chain. I think this last year with COVID, we heard supply chain over and over and over in the media. It was the first time ever. And people really started to ask questions like, what is supply chain? And I think Greg gave an outstanding response to what is the supply chain. My simple answer is it's everything from dust to rust. But it's really something to bring, build that pipeline of the talent and then see how we and the business, as well as working with the universities, can ensure that the curriculum is the best that it can be. So I think what UW-Madison is doing is terrific, is they bring in people like myself and from many other companies and industries to give them input and to meet with the students and to talk about what the latest trends are and where we're going. So for me in the high tech space, risk management is going to continue to be a place where we'll spend a lot of time. I mean, we do the traditional plan, source, make, deliver, enable, and serving our customers. But risk management is going to become a key area. All the automation is another great opportunity. And then the artificial intelligence and machine learning, of course, that's one of our fortes in Google. And we want to continue to utilize that in supply chain and really take us farther into the future with automation, enabling speed and technology and visibility.
Sure. Okay. Greg or Jake, either one of you?
One thing I think I'm very excited about is if you look at all of the capabilities that have been either significantly scaled or even just created and enabled over the course of this pandemic as demand patterns shifted to ordering through an app and having stuff brought to your car, sorting out these supply chain issues that we've talked about in lumber or toilet paper or puzzles or whatever it is. There's been a lot of supply chain innovation that has happened over the last year on probably a much quicker pace than it would have happened in the absence of the pandemic. So I think a lot of those, so we're going to reap the benefits of those capabilities as consumers for a number of years now. And I think companies are going to say, look at the things we were able to do in the last year and a half. Okay, let's hope the pandemic has subsided or is subsiding. Can we keep on that pace? Like, what new things can we enable now that we know that we can bang out results like this so quickly? Maybe we don't need to go through 7 stages of approval to get a project done. Maybe we can just, we can streamline things such that we can just get things in consumers' hands really quickly. And I hope that the pace of innovation continues on this, as it has been over the last year and a half, whatever the starting point is now.
Exciting times. Greg, yourself, any closing thoughts on the future?
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of more broadly, not just the future, but I would have said this 5 years ago, and I'll say it 5 years from now, probably, just because, some of the things that I find most exciting as I think, myself as an educator, as a teacher, as a researcher, but also for people who may be considering this as a career path, a couple of things that I think are great about supply chain. Number one, it's really important. It has huge impact. I mentioned the impact on individual lives, the impact on the global economy, the potential to have impact on the health of the world in terms of human health and environmental health. It's really important and has huge impact. And it's challenging, which is sort of a double-edged sword, but if you're good at it, and it's challenging, that is major career security. If you get a strong education and take advantage of opportunities to learn on the job and develop your capabilities here, there will always be tremendous demand for someone who is able to do that. And also has some of that resilient mindset that Jake was alluding to in terms of innovation. Because the third thing that really is exciting to me about it is it's constantly changing. Yes, we've been talking about pandemic risks for many years, but none of us had really had to deal with it firsthand. And then we did. And then we had to figure out how to respond as supply chain professionals. And there's going to be something else that's going to change. It's going to be some political upheaval that we didn't anticipate, or oil prices are going to quadruple, or environmental issues are going to arise. There are going to be things, some of which we can sort of predict, but we won't maybe know the details until they happen. And we're going to need to respond to those competitive pressures. Currency, digital currencies. What is going to be the next thing is going to have an impact on managing supply chains. And so there's always a new challenge, always something to take on. And I think that's an exciting field to be in.
Sure. All right. Thank you. Well, we're coming in the closing of our end of our time. Jake, Greg, and Claudia, thanks for sharing your expertise about supply chain. And I know I've learned some things today. I hope those that are listening have also learned something today. If you have any questions about supply chain in Wisconsin, feel free to email us at mba@wsb.wisc.edu or email myself. It's Randy Parvin. That's randy.parvin, PARVIN wsc.edu. And thanks, Jake. Thanks, Craig. Thanks, Claudia. And I hope everyone has a great weekend.
Thanks, Randy.
Thank
Randy.
you.
All
You
right.
too.
Take
Bye-bye.
care. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.